chapter 19. Luke chapter 19 is our text for this morning. If you are visiting with us, we have been making our way through the Gospel of Luke, chapter by chapter and verse by verse, for almost 7 years. Kind of ridiculous. But this is what we're doing, and we come again this morning to this passage that is often referred to as Jesus' triumphal entry. You're dropping kind of in the middle of this, so I apologize, but this is where we are. This is that famous portion of Scripture that the church will often reflect upon during what is typically called Palm Sunday, which is the Sunday just before Easter. And so in the providence of God, this is a fitting passage because we are now just a couple of weeks out ourselves from Easter and therefore Palm Sunday. And so this is very much a worthy text to set our minds to. And so let me just begin here by reading this for us. And then we'll get into it. This begins in verse 28, and I'm going to read through verse 44. So again, Luke chapter 19, verses 28 through 44. Here's what Luke records under the inspiration of the Spirit. He said, "And after he said these things, he, Jesus, was going on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. And when he approached Bethphage and Bethany, near the mount that is called Olivet, he sent two of the disciples, saying, 'Go into the village ahead of you there, and as you enter, you will find a colt tied, which no one yet has ever sat upon. Untie it and bring it here. And if anyone asks you, why are you untying it, you shall say that the Lord has need of it.' So those who were sent went away and found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owners said to them, 'Why are you untying the colt?' And they said, 'The Lord has need of it.' And they brought it to Jesus, and they threw their coats on the colt and put Jesus on it. And as he was going, they were spreading their coats on the road, and as soon as he was approaching near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles which they had seen. And they were shouting, 'Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest.' And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, rebuke your disciples.' But Jesus answered, 'I tell you, if these become silent, the stones will cry out.' And when he approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, 'If you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side, and they will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation.'" Well, just by a way of introduction for this morning, let me help us to sort of step back into this text a little bit and remind us of where we are. It's been a couple of weeks, and so I need to get us back into this. But this is now Monday of Passion Week. Remember, passion comes from the Latin passio, which means to suffer, and so this is the week of our Lord's suffering. And so this event is taking place here on Monday of Jesus' final week. This comes immediately after he's just performed some miracles which have created no small stir in the land. Remember, he raised Lazarus, which was the big one. He then circled back through Jericho. He healed two blind men. That is where he also converted a despised tax collector named Zacchaeus. And so now as he is coming through Jericho, there are thousands of pilgrims that are also traveling down to Jerusalem for the Passover week. And they're, of course, attaching themselves to this already massive crowd, and because they too are hoping to see now displays of messianic power. And so the crowds are just enormous at this point. And so on the Saturday before Passover, let me just give you some chronology to set the scene here a little bit. But remember, Jesus, he leaves Jericho, and he returns back to Bethany, which of course is the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus, freshly raised, this family whom Jesus loves deeply. And so as he arrives, they throw a dinner in his honor. In fact, this is that event in which Mary anoints the feet of Jesus with some very expensive spiced perfume. It fills the house. She then wipes his feet with her hair as an act of reverence and worship. Judas, who of course holds the purse for the funding of Jesus' traveling itinerant ministry, he sees what's going on, and he is not happy. And because he is not seeing Jesus as preeminently worthy of everything, and so as John says, Judas there is already betraying Jesus within his own heart. And so Jesus very intentionally allows Mary to do this. And in front of Judas, and because before all of this is over, Judas will become a very significant pawn in getting Jesus to a cross. And then on the very next day, which is Sunday, people begin to pour into Bethany from all over the place, and because they want to see not only Jesus, but also Lazarus. Lazarus is the chief piece of evidence of Jesus' messianic power. And then, of course, the chief priests are there as well. They're trying to figure out how to get rid of Jesus and Lazarus. And because that miracle specifically was causing many people to follow after Jesus. And so all of that is taking place on Sunday. But then in our text here this morning, we come now to Monday, and Jesus commands two of his disciples, verse 30, to go and fetch him a colt. And we don't have the time to do a full review here this morning, but the meaning of this event, as we saw last time, was to demonstrate Jesus' perfect knowledge, his perfect control, his perfect authority over every event, every detail, every circumstance that's about to unfold over the course of Passion Week. He will possess perfect lordship over all of it, and he will be directing every single step of the way. In fact, it's why the word Lord is used 2 times in this text, and also why the disciples find everything just as Jesus told them. We see that in verse 32. And so everything will serve his needs, his purposes, to fulfill the divine plan of God. And so as he commands these disciples to go and get this colt, what is he doing? Well, he is effectively setting into motion the divine timetable in which he will be put forth as God's sacrificial lamb. In fact, again, as we saw in the right month, in the right week, on the exact right day, this is exactly 483 years from the decree of Artaxerxes from back in Daniel chapter 9. Remember, Daniel prophesies there that there will be 69 weeks where, again, a week in the prophetic language of Daniel is equivalent to 7 literal years. And so 7 literal years times 69 weeks, that comes out to 483 literal years with a 360-day calendar, which is how they calendared in this day. But Daniel says that there's going to be 483 years between the decree to rebuild the temple and then the cutting down or the cutting off of the Messiah, chapter 9 and verse 26. And so what is it that happens in history? Well, Artaxerxes, he makes his decree in 444 BC. And so 483 years from 444 is 33 AD. And this is the exact year in which our text takes place. This is the year of the cutting down of the Messiah. And in fact, not only is this the right year, but it is also the right month. This is the month of Nisan, which is the very first month in the Jewish calendar. And so this is also the month in which Passover takes place. And so on Friday of this week, not only will it be the day in which every Jew will slaughter their Passover lamb, but it will be the day in which God will slaughter his. And so again, perfect timing in terms of the prophetic plan of God. And so in sending these disciples to get this colt, Jesus is now setting into motion essentially the redemptive plan of God, in which certain events that must take place will now begin to unfold in pretty rapid succession, but in order to get himself onto a cross by Friday. And so as we saw, Jesus, he now mounts this colt. He begins to ascend up the east side of the Mount of Olives, verse 36. The people are throwing down their coats, their palm branches as a kind of red carpet, basically, as he is making his way to the city. That was an act of submission by the people in which they really are believing that Jesus is in some way God's Messiah, God's King. And so Jesus, along with his massive crowd, they make their way up. And remember, they can't actually see the city of Jerusalem until they crown the Mount of Olives. And so in verse 37, as they come over the top, Luke says that they all begin to see the city. And then in their anticipation of who Jesus is, it gives way to this extreme outburst of euphoric praise. In fact, the picture here is one in which the whole crowd in this moment just sort of unleashes an uncontrollable adoration. They're hailing Jesus as God's King, God's Messiah. They all begin to quote from Psalm 118, which is a psalm of triumph and victory of Israel over her enemies. And so this is over the top, unhinged, unparalleled praise and adoration. And again, why this moment specifically? Well, because as they crown the Mount of Olives, they're met immediately with a view of Jerusalem in all of her glory. In fact, they'd be looking directly at the eastern wall. They'd be looking at what's called the Golden Gate, which is the main gate in and out of the city. They would have had a perfect view of the temple, which sits right on the eastern edge of the city. They'd begin to see the golden edifice that laces the front of the temple as it's reflecting the eastern sun. The temple grounds would be teeming with all kinds of energy. And so as they see this sight, they explode in praise, and because here is their king and there is his kingdom. And so it's euphoric praise. And then as verse 37 records, Jesus begins to descend down the west side of the Mount of Olives. And then in Matthew, in his record of this, he records a kind of split in the crowds where, of course, Jesus is surrounded by all kinds of people praising him. There's a whole trail streaming down the mountain behind him, shouting his name. But then out of the eastern gate of the city, Matthew states that many people begin to pour out once they realize that all of this noise and all of this frenzied euphoria centers around the person of Jesus, who at this point is just a celebrity in this nation. And so they all come bursting forth to join this parade, and there's just a sea of humanity. In fact, the best estimates say that there's somewhere in the ballpark of 200,000 people who begin to fill up what's called the Kidron Valley, which sits right at the base of the Mount of Olives and is just outside the city walls. And so this would have been just an incredible scene to behold. And then, of course, the Pharisees are in the midst of all of it. They're always hiding within the crowds as they're dogging Jesus' steps at every point and seeking to trap him in something. And so in verse 39, notice they command Jesus to rebuke his disciples. And why? Well, because this kind of praise it's blasphemy. This is the kind of thing that is reserved for God alone. And what was important about verse 39 is that the Pharisees, notice, command Jesus to rebuke the crowds. And why? Well, because at this point, they're now realizing that they've officially lost their voice, lost their influence among the people. And that is significant. The hearts of the people now belong to Jesus. And again, remember, Jesus, he never allowed for public praise, ever. He never allowed for any kind of public adoration in his ministry. And when it did happen, he would put an end to it immediately, and because he didn't want to incite jealousy within the hearts of the religious leadership and bring about a premature execution. And so he allows for it in this moment. And why? Well, because this is the time. Is he buying the superficial hype of this crowd? Well, not at all. Rather, he is letting it happen, and because he wants to inflame the envy that is abiding within the hearts of this corrupt leadership, but to a tipping point. And so again, he knows exactly what he's doing. He is in perfect control every step of the way. He came for a cross, and so he will have nails in his hands by Friday of this week. What is the point? Well, the point to understand is that the death of Jesus was no accident. This was not something that happened against his will, as many pseudo-historians like to try and claim. Rather, it was in perfect accord with his will, and his will was to do the will of the Father. And so every event, every detail, including even the wicked hearts of men, everything from Judas to the corrupt religious leadership to the political aspirations of Rome, all of it will be used simply as pawns under his lordship, as he will now be put forth as God's lamb to atone for the sins of the world. And so in verses 28 through 35, we saw the providential control of Jesus. That was point number one. In verses 36 through 38, we then saw the superficial praise. That was point number two. These people are hailing him as king, quoting Psalm 118, and yet while they hail him as king, they know not what they confess. Their words are true, but what they mean by those words is false. They praise him not for who he really is, but for who they desire him to be. And so it was all superficial. And yet Jesus will use those words to incite rage in these Pharisees. And so this is where we pick it up this morning here in verse 39. All of that's just sort of review for you. And so as these Pharisees command Jesus to silence the crowds, notice Jesus gives a response in verse 40, and this now will mark a very dramatic shift in the tone of this text. In fact, this is a reply that at this point in the flow of Luke's gospel would be shocking, frankly. This is a stunning statement. This is a tragic statement. This crowd is believing that peace has come. Verse 38, they believe that peace for them has finally arrived, and yet it's going to be anything but peace. In fact, they're about to be like those prophesied of in Jeremiah chapter 6 who cry out, "Peace, peace," but there is no peace. They know not what they say. They know not what they confess. They do not understand the times, and so they are merely blind and self-deluded. In fact, again, they're shouting in verse 38, notice, of peace in heaven. And why? Well, because again, they cannot fathom in their own Jewish worldview, their own Jewish perspective, that God could somehow be at peace within his own heart while Israel abides under Gentile and Roman occupation. And so since the king has come, then God himself will finally be able to experience peace within his own heart. And because he is right now grieved by the oppression of his people. And yet what they fail to realize is that the peace that is needed is not some kind of peace within the heart of God. It's not some kind of subjective peace merely within the land or subjective peace in heaven as they're shouting. Rather, what they're needing is an objective peace between them and God. There doesn't need to be peace in heaven. Rather, as the angels sang out at the birth of Jesus back in chapter 2, there needs to be peace where? On earth among men. Why? Because God right now is not pleased with them. And this is the issue. There is right now only hostility. There is a great need then for there to be a judicial peace between a holy God and sinful man whose sin has utterly separated them from their maker. And so this is the kind of peace that Israel is in need of. And yet what is the problem? The problem is that they are blind and they cannot see it. And so this is where we are in this text. This is where we pick it up this morning. And so notice now verse 40. And this is the third and final point, which I'm just going to call here divine condemnation. This will be a happy sermon. Providential control, superficial praise, and now divine condemnation, verses 39 through 44. This is the meaning of Palm Sunday. And so again, verse 39, the Pharisees command Jesus to silence the crowds, but then in verse 40, notice how Jesus responds. He says this, Luke says, "But Jesus answered, saying, and I tell you that if these become silent," and these who? Well, these people, these crowds, Israel. "But if these become silent, then the stones will cry out." In other words, if their praise and their adoration of me ceases, then these stones will cry out. So here's the question of the text. Do these people go silent? Do they go silent? Answer, yes, they do. In fact, the praise of Jesus will cease as soon as Tuesday. The very next day, we'll see this, Lord willing, next time. In fact, notice Jesus here states with this phrase with a conditional statement in verse 40. Remember, a conditional statement is simply an if-then statement. But when he says here that if these become silent with the future tense verb of will cry out, you should read the conditional statement there as possessing certainty. That is to say that this is not actually if these become silent as if he's not certain. Rather, it's better read as when these become silent and because they will. And they do. And in fact, this is a silence, as you know, that has been unbroken for 2,000 years, right? On the part of Israel. A silence that will fall on Tuesday of this week in the year 33 has launched a so far 2 millennia long silence on the part of Israel. in terms of failing to recognize Jesus as her Messiah. In fact, Jews today still say that Jesus was just a first century rabbi, just some kind of failed revolutionary who couldn't quite deliver as promised. He was just a failed, self-appointed messianic figure in a long line of other failed, self-appointed messianic figures, and so he was simply cut down when the hype of his own fame got to his head. And where he obviously made some very serious miscalculations in terms of the power of Rome. And so to this day, the Jews, and specifically the nation of Israel, they're silent. They do not hail Jesus as their Messiah. And the point to understand, and based upon the conditional statement of Jesus here, is that Jesus knew that that is exactly what would happen. And so notice, he says that when these people become silent, and they will, the stones will cry out, where the term cry there is the term of kradzo. It's an onomatopoeic term, which means literally to scream. And so he says that when these crowds go silent and they shut up their confession of me as God's king and God's Messiah, there will be screaming stones. Crying stones. Now, as I mentioned last time, this is the key verse of this entire text. And so the question then is, so what are these crying stones? What does this mean? Well, first of all, there are many places in Scripture that speak of inanimate objects and various aspects of creation that cry out to God, right? And what are they doing? Well, they're crying out in praise of his name. That is to say that in a sense they worship him. And why? Well, because he is the creator and they are the creation. And so just by virtue of their existence, the fact that they carry out God's God-given design, they are testifying to all of creation of its maker. And so in Psalm 96, for example, the psalmist talks about how all of heaven rejoices and is glad, where, of course, heaven there is speaking of the sky and even the celestial bodies. He says that the sea and all that it contains, it roars out in praise to its maker. He says that the fields exalt their creator, the trees sing for joy. Psalm 98 as well speaks of rivers that clap their hands and mountains that shout for joy. We see this as well in Psalm 114. Even Isaiah talks like this in Isaiah chapter 55. And so it's just a poetic way in Scripture of describing the fact that God is worshipped as all of creation testifies to the glory of its maker, but as it does exactly what it was designed to do. It's kind of like the old statement. You look at a painting, you know there was a painter. You look at a building, you know there was a builder. You look at creation, you know there's a what? A creator. Testifies of the beauty of his creative nature. And so everything from the sun to the moon to the stars to even the tiniest little quark that makes up a small little creature at the bottom of the sea, to even something like the complexity of the human eye, which by the way, people have still not been able to figure out. But all of that just declares the beauty and the design and the glory of a glorious maker. In fact, the fact that the earth sits at a perfect 23.5-degree angle so that as it faithfully rotates around the sun, where if we were just a little bit closer, we'd be incinerated. For a little bit further, would be frozen over. And yet it just stays perfectly on its God-established path as he upholds all things by the very word of his power. But as the earth sits at a 23.5-degree angle and just faithfully rotates around the sun, we get the beauty and the glory of 4 different seasons. And each of them with their own unique and peculiar glory. And then as the earth spins on a 24-hour axis, we have the beauty of something like a sunrise and a sunset every single day without fail. And we have then the separate glories of morning time and evening time and nighttime. And what is it doing? It's declaring forth the beauty of its maker, who sustains all of it. And so the point of the psalmist is to say that everything shouts his praise and testifies to his creative nature, but as it does exactly what it was designed to do. In fact, in that sense, the only aspect of God's creation that doesn't do what it's designed to do is us, right? We are the only aspect of this creation who can willfully rebel. We who ironically are made in his image. And yet even a rock, just a solid, inanimate piece of solidified dirt, praises its maker as it sits there and does exactly what it's designed to do. And so as Psalm 19 so wonderfully declares, all of creation cries out in praise to God, and frankly, whether we offer him worship or not, right? But that is not the point of Jesus in this text. And so again, what are these screaming stones? What are they crying out? What do they testify to? This is the question. Well, notice verse 41, where it's now explained. And so Luke states this. He says, and when he, Jesus, approached Jerusalem, he saw the city and wept over it. Now there are several words in the Greek to describe weeping. We see one, for example, in John chapter 11. You know it well. It's the one where Jesus comes to the tomb of Lazarus and he begins to weep. The shortest verse in the Bible. That's the one that kids love to be assigned in Sunday school. But then there is a stronger word that speaks of being overwhelmed by grief. In fact, it speaks of a kind of agony of the soul, and that is the word that is being used in this text. And so understand the contrast of the scene. So as the crowds are coming over the Mount of Olives and they're exploding in praise and joy and adoration, Jesus sees this city, but it moves him to an overwhelming grief, an agony of the soul. And in fact, in a sense, he really is the king of Israel, right? He is God's king. And so in a sense, as he is looking at Jerusalem, he is looking at the capital city of this kingdom, and yet all he can do is weep. And understand that the word here, it speaks of a heaving, it's a sobbing, it's a very strong word. This is far more than just welling up with some tears. He is racked here with overwhelming sadness over the superficiality and the unbelief of these crowds who will not believe. And specifically what the superficiality of their own hearts is going to mean for them. And so as this crowd explodes in praise, what does he see? He sees through all of it. He understands that they're right now adoring him for what they're hoping he's going to be for them, but he does know that they do not understand him for who they need him to be for them. And so he begins to weep because he knows what is coming for them. He knows what awaits them in their rejection. This is the time of their damnation. This is the issue. In fact, in that sense, it's reminiscent of what he said back in chapter 13. In verse 44, you remember it. He said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those sent to her. How often I desired to gather your children together, just as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and yet you would not have it. So behold, your house is left to you desolate." And remember, that was a profound statement of judgment. In fact, it was the idea of Ichabod from the Old Testament, where the glory of God departs from the temple. And so in a sense, Jerusalem is no longer God's house, he says, but it's now just your house. It's been left to you, empty, desolate. Presence of God no longer abides. And so as he comes now to Jerusalem for the very final time, and he breaks down under the sight of this city, and because he knows that the rejection will mean judgment, but as he comes to verse 42, he says this, and it is a heartbreaking scene, frankly, from his perspective. He says, "But if you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace." So again, they're thinking verse 38, notice that peace has come, and so they shout it out, but it is not a true peace. Again, the issue is not peace with Rome, some kind of superficial peace within society. It's not a peace subjectively within the heart of God, but again, what they need is a true objective peace between a holy God and their own sinful hearts. That is the issue. And so he says, if you had only known, that is to say, had you simply embraced the things which make for peace. And what are the things which make for peace? Well, frankly, everything he's been teaching since chapter 4. And so he says that had you known in this day, in this era of me coming to you, in this era of God visiting you in my 3 years of ministry in which I've taken on flesh to give to you everything that you need to know for salvation. If only you would have embraced it and believed it, you would have had peace. What is he saying? He is saying essentially, you have rejected it and you're not ignorant. You have known the things which make for peace. And yet since you refuse them, what is the result? Notice, well, now they have been hidden from your eyes. In fact, notice that term in verse 42. He says, but now, since you've rejected, but now they have been hidden from your eyes. What has been hidden? The things which make for peace. That is to say, the truth of God, the way of salvation, the way of deliverance, the way of gaining access to an eternal peace between you and God. And so what is this? Well, this is an official declaration of turning these people over to the sinful desires of their own hearts and then solidifying them in the rejection. He says, I have been with you for 3 years. I have told you time and time and time again the way of salvation, the way of deliverance, the way of peace, and yet you would not have it. You have refused. You have received a version of me, but you have not received me for who I am and who you need me to be for you. And why? Well, because you've been blinded by your desires of what you want me to be for you. Which, by the way, is the reality of many professing Christians. There are many who embrace a version of Jesus, a superficial version of who they want him to be, but they have not known him for who he really is and what they need him to be. And so what is the reality for you now, he says? He says, well, that the day of grace essentially is now over. This is the gavel dropping. Heartbreaking. After 3 years of ministry, he now seals them in judgment. What does he say? He says, the truth from this point forward, notice, will be hidden from your eyes. And by the way, that is what is known as a divine passive, where it speaks of something that God himself does. Where, notice there's a point in which he'll actively hide the truth from a person, which again is why Israel has not been able to embrace Jesus as Messiah for 2,000 years. And why, by the way, Paul says in Romans chapter 11 that there right now lies over Israel a partial hardening. And it will remain there, as he says, but until when? Well, until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. Chapter 11, verse 25. Which is exactly what has been happening for 2,000 years as people from every tribe, tongue, and people and nation come to receive Jesus as God's Messiah, as the Jewish Messiah, and yet Israel cannot. They are blind to it. And so this is the moment in verse 42. This is the moment in which Jesus declares officially that the truth of who he is will be actively hidden from their eyes, and it remains to this day. And by the way, let me just say here that is something that God will often do even beyond Israel. In fact, it's what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 1, where he says that if a person rejects and they suppress the truth of Jesus long enough, that there is a time in which God will actively give a person over to the sinful desires of their heart, where they, in a sense, become solidified in that rejection and unbelief. And people say, well, that sounds cruel. How could God do something like that? Well, that is not the question to ask. Rather, the point to observe is that God is just giving them over to what they're wanting. They have heard the truth. They have rejected the truth. In fact, Paul says that they're actively suppressing it. And so it's not as if they're ignorant. And so all God is doing is he's just giving them over to what they sinfully desire. And yet what is that? Verse 18 of Romans chapter 1, it's an act of judgment. It's a form of judicial wrath, Paul says, in which he essentially unhooks a person from restraining grace, in which God is keeping their conscience soft to the things of God. But there is a point in which he does it no more. There is a time in which he gives the person over. And so let me just say here once again that there are perhaps some in this room who've been coming here for years. I don't know who you are. Just statistically, they're probably here. And you have been hearing week after week after week after week the things which make for peace between you and your God. You've been hearing the message that you're a sinner who in this very moment dwells under the verdict of eternal guilt before God, before a holy and righteous God. And so you've been hearing that you need to get right with him, and that you need to get right with him, but before your case gets to his courtroom, right? Which will be the day of judgment, where all of us will stand before the judgment seat of God, Romans chapter 14. And so you've been told time and time again that you need to see your sin, you need to see your predicament, and that you're right now not at peace with God, and are therefore living under an immense need for Jesus. And because in Christ, God has sent him forth to pay the penalty of your eternal crimes, which is death. And because God says in Ezekiel chapter 18 that the soul that sins must die, right? It is a just payment for sin. And in fact, if God were to condemn every single one of us to hell for all of eternity, hear this, he would have done us no wrong. That would be just. We have committed infinite offenses against an infinite God, and so the penalty must therefore be infinite, which by the way, is why something like hell is an eternal reality. And you say, well, that sounds harsh. Well, that's because you don't understand the nature of what it means to be an infinitely holy and righteous God, who is infinitely pure and as the scriptures say, is therefore not one to be trifled with. He is a consuming fire, as the book of Hebrews says, and he is the very one with whom all of us will have to do. And so while we may shrug at sin and we make light of it at times, it is an odious offense in the eyes of a God who is infinitely pure. And yet by his mercy and by his grace and by his love, what has he done? Well, he's made a way. And because while he is perfectly just, he is also merciful and compassionate and gracious. And as the scriptures say, he is slow to anger, right? And so by his own sovereign will and from the depths of his compassion for the sinner, he has made a way to pardon your eternal guilt and redeem you. And how did he do it? Well, not by telling us to go and perform a bunch of religious works or by trying to clean ourselves up or trying to make ourselves somehow presentable to God. And why? Well, because by definition, we can't. You are a sinner to your very core, and so anything that you and I try to do is utterly coated in sin, and so anything that we offer to God is utterly worthless, useless. Which by the way, is why he says in Isaiah that our righteous deeds, that is to say, even our best stuff is what? Filthy rags. Literally in the original, a woman's menstrual cloth. That is what he sees when you try to offer him your morality, your religious works, your philanthropy. It's but filthy rags, unclean. And because he is that holy. And so if you're to be forgiven, here's the point, then it's going to have to be done by something God does for you. Why? Because he is the only one righteous enough to do it. He's the only one pure enough. And so he sends forth his son. He pays the eternal fine for sin, which is death, on a cross as a substitute in your place, as a sacrificial lamb for sin. And so he says that if you'd simply see your need and admit your need for his sacrifice to be applied to your eternal account, then you can be pardoned of your sin, washed white as snow. What is the point? Well, the point is that all of us have heard that message, at least from this pulpit, time and time again, right? And yet, there are some of you, perhaps, who will not embrace it. And why? Well, because you do not see that there is right now an absence of judicial peace between you and God. That is always the reason why somebody doesn't embrace Jesus. You're assuming that you're somehow good enough, and that if you do end up standing before him, he's probably going to let you in because you're probably good enough and because there's people in this world worse off than you, right? And we compare ourselves to others instead of an infinitely holy and righteous God. And so you come here on Sundays, and yet you spend your weeks pursuing everything else. But it's all finite, and it's all going away, and you can't take any of it with you. And yet you're here, and I don't know why you're here, but you're here. Maybe you've got just enough religious guilt within you that it makes you come. It's how you were raised. Friends are here. And so you're here, and you keep coming here for superficial reasons. Maybe you sense a need for community, relationships, sense of belonging. It's something psychological, something sociological. Maybe Jesus will be some good therapy for your anxiety, your depression. That's why many people go to church. You want a better marriage? You want obedient, moral children who will be put on the straight and the narrow? You want to see them happy and safe and successful, and so you're doing the church thing, hoping it's going to put them on a sound path, and yet you forget that they're actually in possession of an eternal soul, and in which they'll have to give an account to their Maker, just like you. Maybe you're needing more meaning and purpose in your life, but whatever it is, you're hoping that God or Jesus will fill the superficial void. But what you will not see, which is what these crowds did not see, is your true need, which is peace, a judicial peace between you and God. And yet an hour is coming in which after you've heard the truth long enough, and this is the point, but God will simply give you over to whatever the superficial desire is, and then harden you in that state. And then as you drift your way through the rest of your life, there will be a moment in which you'll stand before him face to face, condemned. Welcome to Palm Sunday at the Vine. But the point here is to understand that this is not something God delights in. Rather, notice this is something he weeps over. In fact, in that Ezekiel chapter 18 passage where it says that the soul that sins must die, it goes on in that same chapter to say that God does not delight in the death of the wicked. It does not bring him joy to deliver a person over to what their sinful heart is is wanting. But if you suppress it long enough, this is what he does. And that is exactly what he did to the nation of Israel in this text. And so he solidifies them in the rejection. He weeps over their unbelief. If only they would have embraced the things which make for peace. And then in verses 43 through 44, notice what he does. He then gives the details of what this rejection will mean for the nation of Israel specifically. He says, you have made your choice. Here's what's coming. Notice what he says. He says, for the days will come upon you, which by the way is an Old Testament expression used by all of the prophets to speak of a coming judgment. But he says that the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you and surround you and hem you in on every side. And they will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another. And why? Because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. Now let me just break this down for you very quickly. But notice here 5 elements of this coming judgment. And so first of all, notice he says that your enemies will throw up a barricade against you. Now this is speaking of the common practice in ancient times where if you wanted to take control of a city or conquer a city, you would actually build a barricade around it and then block everybody in and essentially starve them out. And so it became a game of attrition, which was very common to the Romans, in which they'd block you in and they waited out. Nobody could come in, nobody could go out. They'd cut off the food. They'd cut off all the water supply if possible. And so Jesus looks at this city and prophetically declares what's coming for them. And when will that happen? Well, it happened. This is exactly what happened. In fact, it happened just 40 years later from this moment in 70 AD, in which under Caesar, Titus Vespasian, Rome comes. They build a wall or a palisades around the city, and they barricade everybody in. In fact, Josephus, the first century secular Jewish historian who was alive for all of this, he tells us that Titus built up a siege or a blockade that was made out of wood. He sealed off the city, and then the Jews, being the Jews, they actually burned it down. But this is the first element of what Jesus predicts, and this is exactly what came to pass. But then second of all, notice Jesus says that the enemy will then surround you. So the Jews, they begin a revolt in 66 AD. Jerusalem being the capital city, it becomes the headquarters for this Jewish revolt. And so then in 70 AD, Rome comes. They lay down that siege where they surround the city. They seal it off. Again, anyone who tries to escape is immediately slaughtered. Why? The time for mercy is over. And then third of all, notice he says that they will hem you in on every side. The word there for hem, it speaks of pressure, and intensifying pressure, escalating pressure. In fact, if you could just imagine the fear at this point of just the common citizen, common family in Jerusalem. Food runs out, water runs out, everything is shut off and cut off. And then if you try to escape, instant death. In fact, Josephus again tells us that 50,000 troops, along with 4 separate legions and auxiliary forces, come and they hem this city in, and it was brutal. And then fourth of all, notice Jesus says that they will level you to the ground, a term which means to shatter, to crumple completely, flatten. And notice it's not just the physical city, but also every single person within it. They're not just the rebels, not even just the men, but actually even women and little babies. And so he hems them in, and then when they're all starving and thirsting and at their absolute weakness, tens of thousands of soldiers enter into the city and begin to systematically slaughter everybody. This is exactly what happened. And by the way, the idea here, we know this, is that Titus, he wanted to completely eliminate the Jew, but also any possible evidence that they ever even existed, which, as you know, is something that has been common for the nation of Israel over the millennia. They've always been under threat of genocide. Why? Ultimately, as a judgment of God. They have rejected their Messiah. And yet it's in the midst of this judgment that they're under, that what is God doing? Well, he's still preserving them, right? He continues to preserve them. And until when? Well, until the fullness of the Gentiles. And so he never allows them to be completely eliminated with him, because he is not done with them. They are still his covenant people, and we'll talk more about that once we get to chapter 21. But as far as Titus was concerned, he was tired of the revolts, which the Jews, by the way, were notoriously known for. And so he gets to the point of wanting to end their existence. And so he begins an assault in April of 70 AD. It runs all the way through and ends in September. And by the way, he does it in the month of April, and because that is the month of Nisan. And what's the significance of that? Well, that it's also the month of the Passover. And so what does he do? Well, he waits till a majority of this nation's population pours into the city, and then he hems them in. And again, it was brutal. Enters into the city, slaughters almost everybody. And then he begins to systematically raze the city to the ground, and not merely the walls or even the structures within it, but most importantly, the great temple itself, the great symbol of the Jewish people. In fact, it was so devastating that the only thing that still remains to this day is just a very small portion of the western wall of the city. We know it now as the Western Wailing Wall. The Temple Mount, of course, is still there, but what sits in the place of where the temple once stood is something called the Rock of the Dome, which is basically an Islamic shrine. And so he lays his siege in April. It's finished by September. Nothing is left. And in less than 40 years after this prediction, literally every element of what Jesus says comes to pass, as hundreds of thousands of Jews are slaughtered and the city is burned. In fact, Josephus writes in his The Jewish War, he says, while the sanctuary, the temple, was burning, neither pity for age nor request for rank was shown. On the contrary, children and old people, laity and priests alike were massacred. The emperor ordered the entire city and temple to be razed to the ground, leaving only the highest towers and a portion of the wall on the west. All the rest of the wall was so completely razed so as to leave no future visitors to believe that the city ever even existed. What is the result? Well, notice in the fifth element, middle of verse 44, he says this, he says, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another. What are those? Well, those then are the stones from verse 40. Those are the stones that cry out. They scream out. What are they crying? They are crying a testimony of Israel's unbelief. They are screaming witnesses of their silence, of their rejection of Jesus as their Messiah. Why was Jerusalem leveled to the ground in 70 AD? Well, secular historians say it's because the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, comes to squelch the Jewish revolt. And while that may be true, in an ultimate sense, Rome was merely God's tool to bring judgment, just as Jesus predicted would happen. And so while the crowds here are shouting Hosanna in the highest for what they want Jesus to be, Jesus weeps because in their rejection of who they need him to be, judgment is now fixed. And so as he says at the end of verse 44, all of this is simply the result of failing to recognize the time of God's visitation. What is that? Well, that is an Old Testament phrase used by the prophets to speak of the fact of God coming to redeem his people. Salvation. And Israel missed it. And so Jesus here, he gives the final verdict in verse 42 that the truth is now hidden from their eyes. And so as he rides into the city on Monday of Passion Week, he knows he is simply riding to his own rejection. And in less than 40 years, this is what happens. And that is Israel's history, and they are still silent. And so let me just end here then by asking the question once again, so what about you? Because that is always the question. What about you? To hear the message of Jesus as God's Messiah, that he has come to seek and to save the lost, and then to still reject him and to not follow him as Lord with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your might, all of your strength. What is the message of this text for you this morning? Well, the message is that just as judgment came upon Israel for rejection, so also it'll come upon all who reject him eternally. And so once again, all of us have been given today the message of Jesus. And that if you're not yet in Christ, then there is right now no peace between you and God, and the guilt of your sin remains. And yet in his wonderful mercy, what has God done? Well, he's given to you another day of life and breath. And why? Well, to give you time to see your need. To see your need for judicial peace. And so as we come to the end here this morning, the call of this text is to recognize that this is the time of your visitation. This is the day, if you've not done so, to see that God has visited you in the preaching of his word. And so what he says to you this morning is to embrace him by faith. Confess your sin to him. See your need. Trust in the finished crosswork of Christ as a sufficient atonement to cover the guilt of your sin. And then follow him as Lord with all of your heart, all of your soul, all of your might, all of your strength, as an overflow of what he has done so wonderfully for you in the cross, where he took your penalty. That is the message that you need, and that is God's gracious visitation to you today. So what will you do?